With us to talk more about Mexico's efforts is Laura Carlsen. She's the executive director of Mira, an international relations think tank based in Mexico City. Welcome to the show. Great having you. I'd like to start off with what Mexico tried to ban junk food in schools twice before. What is different this time, and why might it work?
Well, there's been a lot of pushback from the companies, and it was mentioned that there's cooperation at this point, but that's because they no longer had any choice. It finally passed the Congress, and the government has been insisting for decades now that this was necessary because of this rising rate of childhood obesity. Mexico is now #1 in the world in childhood obesity. And this was a change that we've been watching for decades now. It happened really with globalization because of the importation of these highly processed foods that completely changed the Mexican diet, which used to be based on tortillas, beans, and fruits and vegetables, other local products. So as soon as this began to see this change, that was a result of the importation of these kinds of highly processed foods, we began to see the childhood obesity and also the childhood diabetes rise. The government wanted to attack this, but the companies were unwilling to lose that market, and so they had to fight this until finally they were able to push the law through and begin to implement it this month.
And what are the challenges to implementation, especially with schools facing, this ban on junk food?
There are many challenges to implementation, Diego, because first of all, we're talking about more than 250,000 schools, so there isn't really, a food police of that size that can do the kind of monitoring. The co-ops and the cafeterias in the schools are, as was mentioned, required to make this change as soon as this goes into effect. And there are stiff fines if they don't. So there will be some compliance monitoring. And the other part of the problem, though, is precisely that they are not banning the food that children are bringing to school from their homes, or these stands that go up outside the schools where they can buy the kinds of foods that are being banned within the schools. So there's still accessibility to the kinds of processed foods that they're trying to eliminate, and that's why this public education program is such an important component of making the kind of change that this law requires.
And looking at companies, right? How will schools and especially food manufacturers replace lost junk food revenue?
Well, for the schools, of course, the idea is that they change from selling these processed and sugary foods to selling fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy foods within the schools. We'll begin to see that kind of a change almost immediately. That's the idea anyway. As far as the businesses are concerned, the calculation on the part of the Secretary of Education here in Mexico is that it represents less than 1% of their revenues that they could possibly lose as a result of this change. Of course, the idea is if there's a wider cultural change, that they'll lose even more because they really do not want children, whether it's in the school or in the home, consuming the amounts of these unnutritious and dangerous foods. But for now, it's not a major impact from one day to the next for the businesses, and they may have to think of a new business plan that isn't so harmful to children here in Mexico.
And Laura, what might Mexico learn from other countries that have tried to improve food in schools?
The statistics that were given earlier are interesting because the biggest indicator of whether this is working or not, and the most important, is the health of the children. To begin to see these levels of obesity go down, to begin to see these levels of childhood diabetes go down is very important because it does cause lifelong problems. Some of those countries are already reporting that they have been able to affect those indices, and that's the hope here in Mexico. what can be learned from Mexico is that the government has to persist in standing up against the transnational corporations that are imposing these kinds of products on the children and stand up for its own right to protect the health of its population. What it costs the Mexican government in treating diabetes, in treating high blood pressure and the other diseases that are associated with childhood diabetes is enormous. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars. So this is a prevention effort, both for the health of the children and also one that has a significant economic impact.
And Laura, from the perspective of children, you know, one of the hardest things to change is a shift in thinking of what is considered tasty food, right? What can be done to shift behaviors?
Well, of course, this is an availability strategy. They just won't have the same access to these kinds of foods. But in the long term, advertising is a major factor. They're also trying to reduce the advertising for foods that will be harmful for children. In 2019, here in Mexico, we began with this labeling so that foods have labels on them: excess of sugar, excess of fat, excess of sodium, and parents at least can know what they're risking when they give these kinds of foods to their children. For the children themselves, it's not going to be a cultural change that can happen overnight. And there's a number of factors here. For one thing, you have to convince them that other types of foods are tasty. You have to really change their diets, and that's not something that's easy to do, and it has to be an effort that's shared between the schools and public places and the homes, of course. The other is, you know, and this has been a part of the problem too, that children have a far more sedentary lifestyle than they used to. You know, they're playing more video games instead of being outside. So the government's also going at it from many angles, and as they begin to see children, in fact, themselves begin to see the benefits of a healthier lifestyle, the hope is that they'll continue on this path.